When Peter started to wear the loudmouth clothing, he needed special dispensation because he said, look, this is what I want to do and there's no reason why I can't. I think anybody who thinks that Peter wouldn't have been a major champion if Michael hadn't come to the 2017 UK Open is a fool. The win with Gary was storied because it was seen in the media that those guys didn't really get along. And he said to me once, that gave me the confidence to try something new myself. And I thought, whoa, really?
Hello and welcome to A Life in Darts here at the MODUS Super Series on Pluto TV, where in this brand new series we'll be delving into the life of some of the biggest names, the biggest stars that the sport has ever seen. We'll be going through their backstory, where the foundations began, some of their highs, some of their lows, and maybe even in some cases what the future holds for them. Today, we are discussing the life and times of the two-time world champion Peter Snakebite Wright. It was 2020 and 2022 when he assailed to the summits of world darts. He's also won the world match play in an illustrious career too. And to discuss that is somebody that knows Peter very well, toured with him for many years, the asset Paul Nicholson. We'll talk about the beginnings in just a second, but Peter is somebody that when it comes to the last dart being thrown will go down as a legend of the game because of what he's won. Yeah,
and he's not finished yet. That's the thing. When we think that maybe his best days are behind him, he comes up and does something extra. But if you look at his CV as it stands, it is right up there with one of the best careers that we have seen. And I think if anybody's compiling their top 10 players of all time, Peter Wright has to be there.
Let's go back to the beginning because Peter's career path kind of has two sides to it. Made his debut at the BDO World Championship back in 1995. And there's that iconic picture, isn't there, of him without the Mohican, without the trousers, pretty much plain clothes for that opening match. He'd go on to lose to Richie Burnett, who would go on actually win that particular tournament at the Lakeside. But he was somebody that even 30 years ago was gracing stage and actually as a young man was very, very talented.
Oh, yeah. I think a lot of people forget as well that the tournament structure back then, it was very much a linear thing. You would be a really good local player. You'd play Super League. And for Peter, that was in East Anglia. And you would then play county darts, international stuff. And for Peter, he had a very close relationship with Mervyn King back then. And they won the Gold Cup pairs together. I've got a fabulous photograph of it where they're both clasping one side of an iconic pairs trophy. And you see Mervyn very young and you see Peter in the same sort of form as you saw him in the 1995 Lakeside Championship. Because that was Peter Wright playing then. Snakebite hadn't even been thought of. He wouldn't even come around for maybe the next 20 years. That's how long it would take for him to figure his alter ego out. But at that point in the mid-90s, Peter was a very, very good player. And you don't make the World Championship back then without being very decent. So we've got to give him credit for what he was like before Snakebite was even thought of.
And he was one of those players that probably was a little bit reminiscent of the time. Was very good, very young, but then took a break, went aside from the sport for a little while, and then didn't come back in for another few years after.
Well, I think Peter's journey between 95 and around 2012, it's not spoken about enough because Peter's actually quite a private person, and I want to respect that. But one thing that a lot of people won't know is that he did play darts in that period, just not to the same levels that we expect players to play at now. For instance, he was living in East Anglia. He was quite nomadic at times. He ended up playing for Cheshire at one point, where Cheshire were amassing this ridiculous county team with Tony O'Shea and Dave Routledge, and I think even Davy Richardson played for them at one time. But they were getting players from all over the country because they were trying to do this thing with the inter-county system to win the Premier Division, and they had the most ridiculous A team, and Peter was part of that. But if you go a bit further forward, I think Peter was trying to figure out where his life was going to take him. It could have been as someone working in garages, fitting tyres and things like that, and he could have been someone that just played at Lakeside. But when the PDC system was there, he was able to find the finances with the help of his family and with some other people to maybe move forward and to get the chances that he deserved.
And it wasn't an easy journey for him to begin with. And you could perhaps say that there was a time where maybe he was a bit of a journeyman pro, somebody that was playing in a lot of events, just about qualifying for things like World Championships, but wasn't really making a real indent in those tournaments.
Well, let's be frank. I mean, I played Peter at the World Championship, 13 years ago? And I thought, that's not a bad draw, that. Imagine getting Peter Wright 7, 8 years later. You think, well, this is a nightmare. It's amazing how things change, and confidence is something that when you find it, you just hold on to it as long as you possibly can. But it's true. At one point, Peter was someone who you'd walk into the room and you'd think, cool guy, you always want to talk to him, superb to hang out with, great for a joke, but he was never seen as a top-level serious pro, someone who was going to go and win titles, for example. And there was a time where he was going to walk away from the sport, and his legacy would have been good player, maybe didn't get the wins or the accolades that he could have, but the strength of the man and the strength of his team allowed him to finally get there.
Well, let's talk about that then, because he had a good year in 2012, 2013, did well at the UK Open, played in the first ever Masters tournament. But then before the 2014 World Championship, there was, I suppose, this moment which completely changed everything in the fact that he said, we'll give this one more go, we'll see what happens. And the likelihood was, if that tournament didn't go well, he'd probably walk away from the sport once and for all. But so much happened in that event, and we'll talk about the final against Michael in a second, but there was so much that happened in that event which kind of worked in his favour. He's in the side of the draw with Phil Taylor when he got knocked out early against Michael Smith. And so there was so much that worked in Peter's favour in that tournament. And just maybe sometimes in sport, destiny's meant to happen.
Yeah, and it doesn't really start there. It starts in 2012 when he picks up his first PDC title. And you think for someone who wasn't necessarily that young at that stage, to wait that long for a PDC title, it takes patience and it takes resilience. And that is something that Peter has always had. Patience and resilience can take you an awfully long way in what is a very legendary career. But going into that tournament, yes, the narrative was, do you know what? The last couple of years have been all right. Made the match play, worried some people on stages, but is this really for me long term? And when you draw the line in the sand and you say, this is going to be the tournament where it either happens or we walk away, it creates this urgency that we talk about in this sport a lot. And some people need that jeopardy to do the best they've ever done. And the first memory I've got of Peter in that championship was what he wore in the final. Because I thought he looked like something from Rubik. And I thought, if this is the route you want to go down, Pete, I am absolutely on board with it. Because wandering across the stage, the hairstyles, endless conversations when his wife Jo would cut my hair before winning tournaments in places like Crawley and Barnsley. Many a conversation was had about, me potentially going into the Premier League and doing things like that. But it was actually Peter that was ready to do that more than I ever was. But in 2014, it was different because whether Taylor was still in the tournament or not, Peter was playing at an exceptional level.
You mentioned that, the clothing and things along them lines. When he first started doing it, that ruffled a fair few feathers. There's a lot of people that actually were not fans of it.
Well, if you go back a couple of years before that, the hair was becoming a normal thing. You'd see Peter turning up with a few different colours or a different type of hair, and you think, oh, that's just Peter. It's what he does. You've got a wife as a hairdresser who wants to maybe use him as a muse, and that's totally cool. We all loved it. But when the outfits started to move on and change a bit, there was a lot of chatter because there was a blanket rule back then. The tournament director was Tommy Cox, and he was incredibly traditional. He'd say dark trousers. I mean, even if you wore gunmetal grey that was an off black, he'd be having a word with you saying, where's your black trousers? But James Wade started to wear a dark grey, and some other people tried to bend the rules a little bit. But when Peter started to wear the loudmouth clothing, he needed special dispensation because he said, look, this is what I want to do, and there's no reason why I can't. And fair play to the PDC, they were pliable enough to say, do you know what? Fair enough, this is good for the image of the sport, and it worked great for Peter.
It worked great for Peter. Then it, excuse me, took him to the final against Michael van Gerwen. And that was the moment, wasn't it, where Peter Wright really announced himself on that world stage.
Yeah, if you make a world final, everybody knows your name. And in that final, Peter had an opportunity in what was the final set to take it one step further. Maybe when he puts his darts down for good, he'll think, do you know what, if I'd hit that double 10, would that have been my first one? Would I have had to wait another 6 years for that title and have to go through Van Gerwen so many times with finals and things like that, because he would lose a lot of them at the start. But I think making that final and getting a very healthy paycheck allowed him to have a bit of financial freedom to move forward and to be the player that he always wanted to be.
Then it gave him the invite to the Premier League. Now, if there was a player probably tailor-made for that particular tournament, it was Peter. And once again, he would carry on doing things which, to the establishment at the time, probably upset them a little bit. He had a couple of interesting battles with Michael van Gerwen on the way. But I suppose he was the first player that breed of entertainment, that darts is just more than throwing darts at a board, that there's actually a spectacle here.
Of course. In Dublin, he played MVG and he decided to throw at a segment of the board and he reduced his height by haunching down. Never seen that before. We've seen it since, because if someone does it the first time, people want to try and copy it. But I think there was a different level of confidence in Peter after that World Championship final. Maybe the best compliment that I've ever had from any of my darting friends came from Peter. And he said to me once, before the whole snakebite thing came around, he said, do you know what, when you started doing your sunglasses and tie trick, that gave me the confidence to try something new myself. And I thought, whoa, really? And I'm not taking any credit for what he does, but that was an incredible compliment he gave to me. But if that allowed him to be snakebite, I am so on board with it. But you saw the different level of confidence in that Premier League campaign. He was doing things that he'd never done before, but you could just tell they were things he wanted to do, but now he had the courage to do it.
We spoke about him bursting onto the scene at that 2014 World Championship. He played in the 2014 Premier League, and then he was getting better all the time. He was improving all the time. His major record was getting better all the time. But there seemed to be, very early on, two different types of hurdles. Michael van Gerwen and a major final.
Yeah, but the thing is, a lot of people will look at it from the point of view that he didn't win a lot between 2014 and 2017. But he was constantly knocking on the door of a player that was at his peak. He was playing the best darts that maybe anyone's ever seen on a consistent basis. He was destructive. We talk about the confidence that Peter got from the 2014 World Championship, but look at the confidence that Michael van Gerwen did as well. He was able to move through fields with ease. And even when Peter was evolving into snakebite, Michael was evolving into another version of Mighty Mike that we'd never seen before. Whether it was Peter, whether it was Gary Anderson or other players, they all struggled against Michael. They all struggled to take him out, so it wasn't just snakebite.
When you look back at that period of time, I know Gary Anderson was winning world titles and winning majors. Phil Taylor was still prominent on the scene towards the tail end of his career. Was Van Gerwen against Wright, looking back at it now, the main rivalry of that 2014 to, say, 2021 era?
I don't think there's any doubt about it at all. You think about how many times they've played each other now, it's over 100 times. That obviously is helped by many Premier League campaigns, but Euro Tour finals, Players' Championship events, World Series, Premier League, the lot. And think about the classic matches they've had. I was privileged to be at a European Tour event when Peter Wright would beat Michael 6-0 in a final. And we all looked at each other as if to say, what's just happened there? And there were swathes in this rivalry. I mean, there were words exchanged on camera and in interviews, but I promise you this, they've always seen eye to eye. Mm-hmm. It's a good rivalry. It's never been a mean one. They just want to bash each other up on the dartboard, and it was great to watch, no matter where it was or when it was.
It took Peter a few years to get that breakthrough, but he did at the UK Open in 2017. Now, There was a late pullout for Michael van Gerwen in that particular tournament with an injury. So Peter actually came into that as the favourite. He'd never won a major title before. Everyone said if he doesn't do it now, he'll never do it. And then he had that incredible quarterfinal with Raymond van Barneveld, got through that, and then he played Gerwyn Price in the final. And you felt like that was, to a certain extent, a destiny-defying game, that if he lost that game, would it have ever happened for Peter?
Of course it was going to happen. I think anybody who thinks that Peter wouldn't have been a major champion if Michael hadn't come to the 2017 UK Open is a fool. Because the night before in Exeter, he'd averaged 119 and a half in a Premier League match. And we all looked and said, if he's going to the UK Open, he's going to win this thing. I don't think he was going to be stopped at that tournament. I think he was destined to win that one. And after that, he became a different beast. So we can't forget the precursor to that win.
Then he plays Michael in the Premier League final a few months later. And at this point, it's probably the first time in a number of years where there's been a genuine debate as to who the best player in the world is. Peter playing the best darts of his career so far. Michael still playing as Michael does. And Peter had a massive lead in that final and then misses those darts at 8-8 to win the competition. Michael picks his pocket. And then there was a feeling of, okay, he can win titles, but is Michael van Gerwen that bridge that he just cannot gap?
Yeah, I think at the time that was seen as a narrative. Obviously, because of retrospect, we know that that wasn't the case, because Peter would actually go on to beat Michael many times. But at that point, you just get the feeling that two people were clashing, and that was a huge opportunity for Snakebite to win a Premier League. He hasn't won one and isn't in the 2025 Premier League, so maybe he's destined never to win that title. So that will sting a bit. But at the time, we remember thinking with our head in our hands, oh, Peter, please don't miss this, because we know how heartbreaking it could be. If you remember the final, Peter missed the darts to beat Michael, and when he takes the penultimate leg, in the last leg, Peter's absolutely gone. And if you're a human being, you can understand why, because that must have been wrenching.
He missed 6 match darts, but one thing about the story of Peter is resilience. 2 days later, he'd actually go on to win a Pro Tour event, and scar tissue was something that followed him around for a number of years. But then, to quote the phrase from Rod Studd, Peter would get it right eventually. We fast forward a few years, and actually went into the 2020 World Championship a little bit out of form in comparison to the previous couple of years. He was seeded 7th for that event, which, when you compare what happened in the last few years, was unheard of. We have to go to that game against Noel Malik-Dem. It's probably seen as one of the biggest what-if moments in darts. The Filipino has an opportunity to beat Peter Wright, get rid of him. He doesn't. Peter wins that game, and then suddenly it felt like things just began to change for him.
You know how dart players tend to do this a lot? They point to the floor and they say, I'm not going anywhere. Yeah, it all started with that Malik-Dem game. Look at when Peter takes at the 140. It's now a famous 6-dart conversion, isn't it? Because of what Rob Cross did to win the 2018 World Championship. But when he hit the 140 the conventional way on double 10, he points to the floor and he says, I'm not going anywhere. And it turns out he was completely right. That was a resilient shot that everybody will always remember, and it was career defining.
And then he'd make his way through the tournament, beat Luke Humphries in the quarterfinals. That was just when Luke was beginning to get on the scene. But then he played Gerwyn Price in the semi-final. Now, at that time, again, that was another rivalry that was really beginning to build between the pair. Peter would deal with Gerwyn quite nicely, quite comfortably. And then we get to the final. Michael van Gerwen again. It felt like the story of Peter's career so far. Whatever he does, wherever he goes, it is Michael that is always the obstacle that is going to be in his way.
Well, a bit like an assault course. If you don't like going over the wall, you just got to figure out how to get over it. And it was always going to be Michael at some point. But it just goes to show that he was ready for Michael 6 years later. He was a better player. He was more balanced, better in focus, and his equipment was perfect for that final. Look at how close the double 10s were to win the title until he hit the one shot that actually gave him the trophy. He went to his manufacturer and said, give me a dart that will give me a world championship. And when he started using this version, he said, I am going to win a world championship with these darts. And he was right. very, very right.
A very emotional moment, and I think it also one of the most iconic commentary moments of all time from Rod Studd. And this time, Peter gets it right, because it was a lot of turmoil and trouble for Peter for so many times. And I suppose if you're going to get one over somebody that's denied you so much, you do it in the World Championship final.
Yeah, it's absolutely right. I can't imagine what he was feeling when it all sunk in, but I actually spent a bit of time with Peter after that final, because I was working on a show, and he came backstage and did an interview with us for about 30 minutes. He looked a lot calmer than I thought he would be, and that tells you that he was completely ready to become world champion, and he was ready to do what he had to do for the next few years.
The next year, he'd come dressed as the Grinch for his title defence. That was the COVID year, but he actually played the only night, didn't he, where there was fans in because of the whole tier system we had back then. He beat Steve West. He wouldn't go on and defend his world championship, but if we go forward about 7 months down the line, we go to the Winter Gardens in Blackpool. He was an immovable object at that world match play.
There had been things happen even before that. He'd become European champion, of course, at Oberhausen, but that world match play, he was by far the best player in the tournament. We looked at each other when we were working on the radio for it, and we said, I don't think there's anybody can stop this guy. I hadn't seen anybody dominate a match play since Phil Taylor in his proper peak days, where he was untouchable. No matter what anybody did, they weren't going to beat him. And when he beat MVG in the later stages of that event, Michael was playing really well, but he couldn't get anywhere close to him. That will probably go down as Peter Wright's finest hour. Even though he's won 2 world titles, that performance in that tournament is the one he can be most proud of for me.
I remember him saying to Michael Bridge after he won that tournament, anyone that bet on me to win the World Match Play as an outsider, bet on me to win the World Championship. I will win the World Championship again. Well, he was a man of his word, because he would do it again. There was some obstacles in the way. He played Michael Smith in the final. But when that game went to 5-5, Peter Wright found a 2-set burst, the like of which have we ever seen before in a world final?
No, probably not. We have seen great bursts. We've seen huge sets from Luke Littler and Gezi Price in the last few seasons, but that sustained burst to get the job done, it just goes to show how ready he was to defend the prize money from the 2 years previous, because he was under huge pressure in 2022. He had £500,000 in ranking money coming off, and he completely defended it. And doing that the way he did just goes to show how strong he'd become.
And he then become world number 1, the oldest ever first-time world number 1 in PDC history. And at that point, was there any doubt that Peter Wright was the best player in the world?
At times, he has been the best player in the world. And whether he believed that internally or whether it was based on rankings and titles won, he can say to himself, whenever he decides to stop playing darts, at times, plural, I was the best player on this planet.
Then the World Cup wins as well, a couple of them in an illustrious career, one with Gary Anderson, one with John Henderson. His affinity with that competition can't be denied either.
Yeah, it's just another notch on the belt, isn't it? I mean, was it 48 PDC titles to date? I know he wants to get to 50 because it's such a round number. But the emotion on Peter's face when he won with John Henderson, that was fabulous. But maybe if we take the sentimentality out of that one, the win with Gary was storied because it was seen in the media that those guys didn't really get along. And to be able to bond together sometimes with someone that maybe you don't gel with perfectly, but still for the common good, to win a trophy like that for Scotland, which had been dominated by the Dutch and the English over the years, it just goes to show, again, the resilience, not just of Peter Wright, but also of Gary Anderson.
So let's finish by putting Peter in a place, in a ranking in terms of all time. In terms of Scottish, is there a genuine argument he could be the greatest Scottish player of all time, up there with Anderson, up there with Jockey Wilson? And where would you put him in an all-time list? 2 world championships, that world match play at numerous other major tournaments.
For me, he's around the top 5 on the cusp of that, because you've got to have Taylor and Michael van Gerwen and maybe, Gary's right there with him. That's the great thing. I said before the previous World Championship, I'd love to see Gary versus Peter in a final because it would be a duel to see who's the first 3-time Scottish champion. I'd still want that to happen as an old school darts fan. But I think it's really hard to separate Peter and Gary because they've won a lot of tournaments. They've both won the match play. They've both got 2 world titles. Gary's never been world number 1. Peter has. So it's a great debate. But isn't it great that a nation like Scotland has got 2 phenomenal players like that? But what I will say is that I think they're both ahead of Jockey now.
Definitely a great career. Nico, thank you. Thank you for watching at home. Do stay tuned to the Story of series here. It's available on Pluto TV, where you can stream now, pay never.